It's going to be amazing for me, amazingly challenging to follow our three brilliant speakers earlier today. If there's one thing you take away from those three fantastic talks, it's one of the things that Martin says, which is that this has nothing to do about technology. So the next 15 minutes when I'm talking about technology, just keep that uppermost in your mind, because virtually all of the key questions are to do with our culture, our ethics, our values, and how we choose to articulate those. And it's quite interesting that we are in this room, which I've now discovered was some sort of marker of the Victorian age and the railway revolution, because it's fitting. One of my arguments is that we're really coming to the end, hitting the buffers, as it were, of the industrial age set of values and the way in which we run our economies, because we've moved quite distinctly into the information age. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has chosen a great venue, at least for my talk. So as was mentioned, I run a newsletter called Exponential View, but I do that on the side. I'm a sort of portfolio person. I'm an early stage venture capitalist, and I advise large companies about what to do with technology. And on the one hand, I'm incredibly optimistic about what we can do. I mean, it makes me super happy about seeing the sorts of things that, that Jesse is up to, and lots of the other founders that I see, and look at what's happening in research labs. But I'm also quite often feeling quite gloomy, quite sort of stormy and melancholy about some of the impacts that we're seeing with technology in the world today. But I think it's important for us to recognize that technology is a gift, that it is one of the tools that can help us mitigate some of our biggest challenges, whether it is climate change or human migration or resource scarcity or diseases of senescence. It has a remarkable way of making scarcity disappear and making rare things abundant. Long lives were the domains of kings. Backbreaking work was reserved for most of us except for our feudal lords. Holidays and travel was for aristocrats. Education for the very, very privileged. The interplay of technology within our societies has generally made those things more widely available. I love this graph which shows English GDP per capita since about to the 1200s. And there are only three things that knock it off track for a little while. Pestilence and disease, so the Black Death, the occasional war, so World War I, World War II, and so on, and just at the tail end, bankers blowing up the global financial system. And we should remember that technology, even if we feel a little bit negative about it sometimes, has done tremendous things to things that are essentially human. Child mortality. Back in Sweden in the 1750s, as this blue line, it was an everyday problem. And today, in virtually every country, we've eliminated childhood and maternal mortality. Or even something as simple as light. In the UK, in the 1700s and the 1800s, light was still a luxury. Today we have so much light, we sometimes light the undersides of our bookshelves, and it's essentially free. And we shouldn't forget that we've nearly connected 5 billion people to the phone system, giving them access to their communities and their relatives and their loved ones wherever they are in their world, and giving them access to global markets. I didn't say it was all good news. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've become quite concerned and alarmed about the impact of technology and technology companies on our societies, on our systems of governance, on industries, on the concentration of power, on the treatment of certain groups. The fact that technologists seem to fail to recognize their role in society. And technology, despite its capabilities, doesn't seem to have solved lots of our big problems. We still have huge problems with the gender balance. We have the power of entrenched interests. Inequality is rising everywhere in the world. And in the US, lifespans are actually in retrograde. And you get these curious things. At the same time that we tackle human obesity, we've sequestered billions of animals in appalling conditions to feed us overweight humans. and at the same time we know what we've been doing to our carbon budget. But I do think that over the next 15 to 20 years, the promise of technology is greater than it's ever been. But we have to be, therefore, much more concerned with some of our experiences over the last 10 to 15 years of the negative consequences of just being too technocratic in our approaches. So I want to say something about what technology is. I mean, technology arises from human interaction. It's our way of creating a means to do something useful, whether it's to skin a rabbit or tally the amount of wheat we have or to phone our mums. There's a great myth that is perpetuated about the brilliance of individual investors. They saw what others didn't see and they capitalized on it. But it's not really like that. You know, individuals play a role for sure, and as an investor I look for brilliant founders. But they're not standing merely on the shoulders of giants. They're actually in a grand enabling web of systems and institutions that got them there. It's a web of systems that allows them, in the case of Thomas Edison, to fail 10,000 times before he can succeed the first time. And technology is also, in some sense, like a set of these Matryoshka nesting dolls. It sort of contains, they contain each other. One contains the next and encompasses another. You can't get to the fifth Matryoshka doll without going through the first four. You can't get to the iPhone or the next brilliant blockchain business without going through a range of other technologies beforehand. Now, according to the way in which we measure value, which is a company's ability to generate profits today and in the future, technology companies have done extremely well. So 8 of the top 10 biggest companies are these tech firms like Apple and Microsoft and Tencent. And it's fitting that earlier this week, talking about the passing of the industrial age, General Electric was dropped from the Dow Jones Industrial Average, replaced by a shop, I think. And this technology revolution really started back in 1971 with the 4004 microprocessor from Intel. And it was in that mid-70s period that the Altair 8800 came out, and the Apple I, and then famously the Apple II, which really formed the industry. And off that formation came these great companies that dominate stock markets today. But how did that actually happen? Well, what happened was that we created a virtuous cycle. When computers came out in the late 70s, software developers developed applications for them. And as consumers bought those computers, it generated some profits, which was reinvested in producing better chips. The better chips allowed software developers to write better applications, which made the computers more useful, which meant more people bought them. And that cycle spun faster and faster, and it created giants like Intel and Microsoft and Apple. It was also supported, oh, I think I've got my slides slightly in the wrong way, okay. Oh, we've lost one slide, never mind, I'll go back. It was also supported by an observation called Moore's Law. So Moore's Law famously is a relationship that says every couple of years, the number of transistors you can pack onto a computer chip doubles, and that means that the power, the speed of that chip doubles for a given dollar cost. And Moore's Law has essentially compounded for about 60 years. For a variety of reasons, it's petered out, but other things have replaced it. But what it means is that a 2010 iPhone 4 that costs $350 at the time had the same computational power as a 1985 Cray 2 supercomputer that cost $35 million. And a typical phone is about 1 trillion times more capable than the best computers that were available 60 years ago. And so Moore's Law has driven the decline in the price of computing, making compute cycles essentially free. Just quick check. How many of you have a supercomputer lying in a kitchen drawer or a bedroom drawer that you never use? Okay, I'll ask that again. How many of you have a phone in a drawer that you don't use? Right, all of us, supercomputers, which NASA would have paid its eye teeth for in the late 80s to get their hands on. So even though the price of compute has declined, these companies got huge, and the question is, why did that happen? And it's happened because in the last 10 to 15 years, we have moved our access to resources onto the internet and through software. You can't book a train ticket, or you don't book a train ticket without searching for that on Google. You don't watch a movie without going to iTunes or Netflix. You probably don't order multivitamins without going to an online store. And these software companies, software platforms have a really curious behavior, attribute, and that is that they all use machine learning or artificial intelligence, which thrives on data, to deliver us a better experience. And that creates a data network effect, which is a virtuous circle, at least for the platform in question. You take your platform, a search engine or a shop, you use machine learning to make it a better product. Because it's a better product, more people use it. Because more people use it, it generates more data. That data gets fed back into the machine learning system, which improves the product yet again, which means more people use it. And that wheel spins very, very quickly. That data network effect makes it very hard for new entrants to come into the market. Ask Microsoft, which spent billions of dollars trying to compete with Google in web search, or ask the sort of littered hulks of retailers and e-commerce companies that try to compete with Amazon. But what you end up with is you end up creating these things that have, if they're not monopolies, they have significant market power, they have strategic power, they have pricing control, and they dominate in ways that our regulations struggle to keep up with. Now, if the theme of Moore's law created all of this value that we have seen in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, that was just a single technology that was going exponential, that of the microprocessor. But what's exciting today is that we've got multiple different technologies in lots of different domains that have different engineering paths to becoming amazing, that are all progressing at exponential rates. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one example is the cost of genome sequencing. So we first sequenced the human genome back in 2001. It apparently cost $100 million, although some people tell me it cost $3 billion, and I will get to the bottom of this. If genome sequencing had declined in price in the same way that computational power had, it would cost us around $60 to $70 million per human genome right now to sequence. But in fact, it costs us around $1,000, that red line. So genome sequencing pricing has improved far faster than the dramatic improvements we saw in computational power. And that has a lot of implications for things like personalized medicine. If we think about our energy transition, one crucial thing is going to be the availability of cheap energy storage, lithium-ion batteries. And even though this is a real physical chemistry type of problem, the price performance of lithium-ion batteries has been improving 20% per year, thereabouts compounded, since 2010, and continues to impress. And we've just recently seen in the US solar photovoltaic contracts at around 2 cents per kilowatt hour, which is competitive with pretty much anything. Or further afield and up in space, we've seen a boom in the number of Earth observation satellites being launched. That green line, which shows 2016's numbers, 176 satellites, with a boom that is continuing. The impact of that will be a radical decline in the price and a massive increase in the availability of Earth observation and remote sensing for agricultural uses, for logistics uses, for shipping uses, and many others. So what's exciting about all of these is that we can combine these independent technologies. They're improving rapidly, but they can all be glued together. They can be glued together with genomics, with software for personalized medicine, lithium-ion batteries with AI to build clean autonomous vehicles, which many companies are building around the world. And the thing that glues them together is software, and nearly all software these days is artificial intelligence, software that learns from experience, software that is not as deterministic and rigid and linear as the software of yore. One of the nice things about AI is that far from stealing our jobs, it's actually giving workers superpowers. So two of my favorite examples, they're very different. At the top is using a machine learning system to help radiologists to faster and more accurately identify, score, and mark up tumors, giving them more time to be good radiologists. And at the bottom, we've got this chair that was co-designed with an AI system. So in this case, the designer came out and said, look, these are my constraints. This is my materials budget, which was a cost budget, but equally it could have been an environmental footprint budget. And these are some chairs that I'm inspired by. And the machine was able to go off and explore the space of possibilities in a way that a human couldn't search that space, and come up with something that was manufacturable and met the design parameters. and then the human could go off and select and tweak, and that's what we have at the bottom. So I did say some of this is a bit gloomy, and let's just talk about some of the gloomy impacts that arise from particularly the dynamics around dominant market position. So the first is that we're really seeing rewards to a few. Fully 50% of Facebook's employees earn $240,000 a year or more, and that's pretty significant. And what we've started to see, I mean, California is a great example of this. On the one hand, you have these shiny, happy tech people, the world's number one destination for venture capital, the richest state in the US, and on the other hand, you have a terrible homelessness problem and the highest incident of poverty of any state in America. The second issue, and you know, Martin referred to this, is that the pace of change is really likely to speed up and not slow down. And that can be very difficult for people to adjust to. It can be very, can create quite a lot of fractiousness. I mean, I think that the pace of change is probably connected to the rise of certain types of populist politicians that we're seeing across Europe and other parts of the world. Sometimes people say, well, you're always saying the pace of change increases because that sort of is what tech people do, but I have a data set that goes back to the 1800s showing the adoption rate of consumer technologies in the US. And what you see is that the adoption rate is getting more and more vertical as you head towards 2010 and 2012. And there are so many more damn lines. Does anybody here have a teenage child who's been playing Fortnite? Yeah, sorry. We all apologize for it. I had nothing to do with it. Fortnite has already got to $300 million of profits every month, and it hasn't as yet to launch formally. And that's a pace with which we can get these things into the market. The other thing to think about is what happens with these algorithmic platforms like the Facebooks and the YouTubes and the Netflix, and what their algorithms are trying to achieve. I mean, what the control mechanism is trying to do is to get us to use the site more to drive more advertising revenue. And it turns out that the best way to do that is to shock us. So you get an extremification on YouTube. If you start looking at vegetarianism, you end up with extreme veganism. If you start looking at you know, how to stop your duck feet, which is a problem I started off with, you end up with extreme planking on cliff edges. And the trouble is that is where our public square is. That is where our common ground used to exist, but for kind of slightly bizarre reasons, mostly to drive advertising dollars, we're being pushed further and further apart. It's very easy for the media to look for the single creator, the Tony Stark-like awkward genius who's built this brilliance. And that sense of hero worship really undervalues societal goods, because ultimately creators get where they've got to because of a whole web of socially provided institutions, whether it's educational, basic research, or tax, or roads. But that's not the narrative that we support when we talk about the grand innovations that we use every day. Now, we're in this room. This is a sort of from the industrial era where there was a set of rules that were built off the back of, you know, Adam Smith and David Ricardo and J.S. Mill. But we are also now at a point where the fundamental technological underpinnings and the way in which we create things, the way in which we access them is changing. You know, intangible goods rather than physical things are taking more value. People are more inclined to share than to buy. And all of this requires a new consensus and a new conversation, which is why I get enthusiastic by gatherings like this. But I also think it's important for people who are not involved in the technology industry to understand fundamentals of the technology and not allow it to be communicated to them by people outside of the space, because the way in which things like AI and platform businesses operate is very different to the way in which a car used to operate or a car manufacturer. As we build these new rules for the change that is inevitable, one thing that I would always leave you with is that technology is far too important to be left to technologists. And as Martin said, it's also not ultimately about the technology. Thank you very much.